Victims Protection Act. On behalf of the President, thank you for joining me to celebrate this milestone and to recognize the incredible work that has been done across this country to tackle modern-day slavery, pursue justice for victims, and hold traffickers accountable. Thank you to Attorney General Barr, Secretary Scalia, Secretary Azar, Acting Secretary Wolf, Deputy Secretary Bygum, for all being here today. Under your leadership and in coordination with the full of government, the United States is committed to ending human trafficking in all of its grotesque and evil forms. I'm also grateful to be joined by so many members of Congress and special guests, including Congressman Smith, Congresswoman Wagner. Yes. Please stand. Congressman McCall, Ambassador at Large, yes. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Brownback. And U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See, Callista Gingrich. Thank you, Callista. Further among us, and I'd love you all to stand as well, are members of the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, the President's Public-Private Partnership Advisory Council to End Human Trafficking, as well as recipients of the Presidential Award for Extraordinary Efforts to Combat Trafficking in Persons. Thank you. Each of you possess a wealth of knowledge and action-oriented approach that are invaluable resources in this fight against this crime and as we seek to best support survivors. Human trafficking is believed to be one of the largest criminal activities in the world, with an estimated 24.9 million people trapped in forced labor, domestic servitude, or commercial sex trafficking. It is also, sadly, one of the most lucrative illegal industries worldwide, generating over $150 billion in annual profit. This issue has no demographic limitations and exploits society's most vulnerable, often women and children, and particularly targets runaway and homeless youth. In 1983, Robert Fuller and Louis Malteris, two middle-aged men, both born with intellectual disabilities, were discovered working on a dairy farm in Chelsea, Michigan. Isolated from the world, these two men were working 17-hour days with no pay and living in squalor. They were hidden in plain sight. The ruling of United States versus Kobminski, as Robert and Lewis's case would come to be known, recognized that the U.S. involuntary servitude and slavery statutes were not sufficient in their scope, lacking necessary provisions to guarantee protections for these men and so many others. This case spurred what would become a national outcry for legislation to address modern-day slavery. In 2000, Congress responded. Under the leadership of former Senator Sam Brownback and Representative Chris Smith, whom you'll hear from shortly, Congress passed the monumental, bipartisan Trafficking Victims Protection Act. This landmark piece of legislation changed the landscape of the conversation around human trafficking and elevated the U.S. government's capabilities to combat this evil. The TVPA created a number of protections for victims, ensuring that they had access to necessary services. It also sharpened prosecution capabilities, criminalizing a broader scope of human trafficking-related crimes and requiring convicted traffickers to provide full restitution to their victims. The TVPA enhanced prevention efforts as well, creating for the first time in U.S. history an office to monitor and combat trafficking in persons within the State Department. The TIP office, currently led by Ambassador at Large John Richmond, is tasked with producing the the annual Trafficking in Person report that serves as our key diplomatic tool to engage foreign governments on tackling this issue collectively. It goes without saying that the guests in this room at the TVPA ushered in a new era in anti-trafficking work. Over the past 20 years, this legislation has shaped how our country pursues justice for victims, holds traffickers accountable, and prevents further cases of trafficking. So that brings us today. Much progress has been made, but we recognize that this issue is still, unfortunately, so pervasive in our own communities and across the globe. In the early days of this administration, President Trump committed to bringing the full force and weight of the U.S. government to tackling this horrific problem. Since then, I'm proud to have helped him deliver on this promise, signing 9 pieces of legislation into law that directly address human trafficking. And we're just getting started. These bills, amongst other things, expanded on the provisions of the TVPA of 2000 to include required law enforcement victim training and HHS grants authority for academic institutions to educate teachers and students of signs of sex and labor trafficking, and so much more. In 2017, President Trump signed an executive order to dismantle transnational criminal organizations, including those trafficking human beings. This action elevated human trafficking as a national security issue, as traffickers' profits enrich their organizations at the expense of human lives. Further, the president has prioritized funding for anti-trafficking work, proposing a $42 million budget increase for 2021 that will enhance human trafficking investigations, prosecutions, and victim services. We are resolved and we are relentless in the fight to hold perpetrators accountable and restore human dignity for victims. This administration has fought and will continue to fight this crime and ensure that survivors can access the services they need. Human trafficking is not solely an international issue or a crime that must occur across borders. Human beings are being sold right here in America, in our own backyards and in our own communities, in neighborhoods across this country, in rural and urban communities, as well as tribal lands. We cannot turn a blind eye to trafficking that happens at home, and we cannot tolerate the exploitation of our own citizens. The prevalence of domestic trafficking was brought to a new light for me on a recent visit to Atlanta. Facing one of the nation's highest rates of human trafficking, the city of Atlanta has taken big strides forward to equip survivors with long-term care and the skills they need to succeed as they begin to rebuild their lives. One of those facilities leading this effort in Atlanta is Wellspring Living, a nonprofit providing a path forward to survivors of domestic sex trafficking. Wellspring's motto is to live and dream again, a beautiful testament to what I witnessed that day. I met incredible, courageous women in Wellspring Living's Women's Academy, which is dedicated to helping survivors attain skills for their GED, an apprenticeship, and a future career. A few of those ladies join us here today, including Jessica Hamlet. Jessica's story is one of remarkable transformation. Jessica shared with me her very personal and heartbreaking experience of being trafficked for sex domestically after surviving childhood abuse, losing custody of her children, and facing serious challenges with drug addiction herself. Despite all this, Jessica recently completed an apprenticeship at Delta Airlines, regained custody of her beautiful, sweet daughter, who I had the honor of meeting that day in Atlanta, and now works full-time for the city. Her resilience is inspiring, and I would be honored if Jessica would come up and say just a few words.